They called her lazy. They called her foolish. They laughed at the overweight woman who wandered the creek banks picking weeds, while every other wife in Ash Hollow tended proper rows of vegetables. When the beetles came and destroyed every carefully planted crop in the valley, every cabbage, every potato, every last bean, those same neighbors came crawling to Clara Ashbourne's door with empty bowls and hungry children. But before they would accept her help, they would first try to destroy her. This is the story of the woman everyone underestimated, and the season she became the only reason any of them survived. If this story moves you, hit that like button and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The morning the beetles arrived, Clara Ashbourne was the only person in Ash Hollow who wasn't surprised. She had seen the signs 2 weeks earlier, the strange silence along the eastern creek bed, the way the toads had disappeared from the low spots near the fence line, the particular quality of stillness that settled over the fields in the late afternoon when there should have been the constant background hum of insect life. She hadn't said anything to Elias about it. She had learned, over 4 years of marriage, that saying things to Elias before they happened was a reliable way to give him one more thing to worry about, and Elias already worried enough for 3 men. So she had simply gone about her business. She had walked the creek banks the way she always did, early in the mornings before the heat settled in, filling her basket with lamb's quarters and young nettles, and the first tender shoots of purslane that came up through the gravel near the water's edge. She had noted which plants the insects avoided. She had paid attention to what was still green and untouched, while other things were being quietly consumed. That was Clara's particular talent, and it was also the thing that made the people of Ash Hollow laugh at her. She was not a beautiful woman by the standards the valley applied to beauty. She was heavy, had been heavy since childhood, built in a way that her mother had once described charitably as sturdy, and that the women of Ash Hollow described considerably less charitably in the shade of the church steps on Sunday mornings. She was 26 years old, and she wore her dark hair pinned up in a practical knot that was never quite as tidy as it should have been, and her dresses were always slightly too short at the hem because she had let them out at the seams so many times there was nothing left to work with. She had her mother's broad hands and her father's stubborn jaw, and she had never once in her life been described as delicate. She had also never once in her life done things the way other people expected her to. The Ashbourne farm sat at the southern end of the valley, where the land flattened out toward the creek, and the soil was dark and rich, but prone to flooding in wet years. Elias had inherited it from his father, who had broken the ground with his own hands 20 years before, and Elias treated the land with the kind of reverence other men reserved for things they considered sacred. He was up before dawn every morning and in the fields until the light failed. He kept his rows perfectly straight. His fences were tight, his equipment mended before it broke, his grain stored dry. He was, by every measure the valley used to assess a farmer, an excellent one. He was also, Clara had come to understand, a man who cared deeply about what the valley thought of him. "People are talking again," he told her one evening in late July, coming in from the fields with his boots heavy with mud and his face carrying the particular expression that meant he'd had an uncomfortable conversation with one of the neighbors. He hung his hat on the peg by the door and stood there for a moment without looking at her. "About you walking the creek banks again this morning. Mildred Boone saw you from her upper field." Clara was at the stove stirring a pot of soup. She didn't turn around. Mildred Boone spends half her life watching things from her upper field that aren't any of her business. "Clara, I'm just saying what's true. What you're doing makes us look—" He stopped. He pressed his lips together and tried again. "People wonder why you aren't tending the kitchen garden. We've got beds that need work. Folks notice." Clara set her spoon down on the rest beside the stove and turned to look at him. He was a good-looking man, Elias. Lean and sun-darkened, with honest eyes and hands that were perpetually calloused from work he was proud of. She had married him because she loved him and because she had believed at 22 that love was sufficient grounds for marriage. She still loved him. She also spent a fair amount of time wishing he cared slightly less about what Mildred Boone could see from her upper field. "The kitchen garden is fine," Claire said. "I watered it this morning before I went out." "It's not just about the watering. It's about how it looks. A woman wandering around picking weeds." "I'm not picking weeds." "Clara, that's what people see. Then people don't know what they're looking at." She turned back to the stove and lifted the lid on her pot, and the smell of it rose up, wild onion and nettles and something earthy and warm that she had seasoned with dried herbs from the bundles hanging above the window. It smelled like nothing Elias could have named from any cookbook he'd ever seen, and it smelled extraordinarily good. He stood there for a moment, and she could feel him deciding whether to continue the argument. He decided against it. That was another thing she had come to understand about her husband. He chose his battles carefully, and he was not wrong to do so. She was not a woman who could be argued out of things she had already decided. He came to the table and sat down heavily, pulling off his boots. "I'm just asking you to be a little more careful about how things look, that's all." "I know that's all," Clara said quietly. She did not tell him what she had seen along the creek banks that morning. She did not tell him about the silence or the missing toads or the strange stillness in the eastern fields. There would be time enough for that. The beetles came on a Thursday. Clara was awake before them, the way she was always awake before things happened, sitting at the kitchen table with her second cup of coffee and watching the way the dawn came up gray and strange over the eastern hills. The light that morning had a quality she couldn't quite name, yellowish at the edges, heavy somehow, like the air before a hailstorm but without the pressure drop. She sat with her coffee and watched it, and felt the particular unease that had been living in her chest for 2 weeks settle into something heavier. Then she heard it, or rather, she heard the absence of what should have been there. The birds had gone quiet, every last one of them. She set her coffee cup down very carefully. 30 seconds later, the sound began. It was low at first, almost like wind, a soft chittering that could have been leaves if there had been any wind. Then it grew. It came from the east, rolling across the valley like a slow wave, and by the time it reached the Ashbourne farm, it was loud enough that Elias came down the stairs 2 at a time with his boots still unlaced. "What is that?" he said, standing in the kitchen doorway. Claire was already at the window. "Beetles," she said. He came to stand beside her, and they both looked out at the fields, and the fields were moving. Not the way fields move in wind with that long, graceful rippling. These moved in a dense, dark mass that came across the ground with terrible purpose, a living carpet that caught the gray morning light and threw it back in 1,000 tiny glints. They came over the fence line from the eastern neighbor's property and spread across the rows of Elias's garden with the efficiency of something that had been very hungry for a very long time. Elias made a sound in his throat that Clara had never heard from him before. He was out the door before she could say anything, running toward his fields in his unlaced boots, and she watched him go and felt the particular helplessness of knowing that there was nothing he could do and that it would take him some time to understand that. She went upstairs and got dressed. She put on her sturdiest boots and tied her hair back and took her largest basket from the hook in the mudroom. Then she went to the kitchen and poured the rest of her coffee into a tin cup she could carry, and she went out the back door, away from the fields, down toward the creek. By mid-morning, Elias had found her. She was 50 yards downstream from the main crossing, kneeling at the water's edge with her skirts hiked up and her hands deep in a stand of watercress, working efficiently and without apparent distress. Her basket was already half full: lamb's quarters, nettles bundled with twine, 3 kinds of wild onion, a fat bunch of purslane she'd found in the gravel. She heard him coming from a long way off because he wasn't trying to be quiet. He stopped at the edge of the bank above her and stood there breathing hard. She looked up at him. His face was something she'd never quite seen on it before. It wasn't just the shock of the beetles. She'd expected that. It was something underneath the shock, a kind of unraveling, like a man who has just discovered the foundation of his house is not where he believed it to be. "They're through the cabbages," he said. "I know." "The potatoes." "I know, Elias." He looked at her basket. He looked at her hands, stained green from the nettles. He looked at the creek and the stands of wild growth along its banks, all of it untouched, completely untouched, and a complicated expression moved across his face. "You knew," he said. "You knew something was coming." Clara sat back on her heels and looked at him. "I thought something might be. And you didn't tell me. You would have told me to stop worrying." He opened his mouth and then closed it, because they both knew it was true. He sat down on the bank above her, not caring about the mud, and put his head in his hands. She gave him a minute. She had learned that Elias needed a minute when things broke. "The Hendersons are already talking about leaving," he said finally, his voice muffled through his hands. "Frank came over an hour ago, said he's going to try to make it to Ogallala before the month's out, see if there's work." Ruth is half out of her mind with worry about the children. The Hendersons have 4 children and no savings, Claire said. They can't make it to Ogallala. I know that. Then somebody should probably tell them so. He lifted his head and looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. And what do we do? Our cabbages are gone, Clara. The potato beds are half stripped already, and it's not even noon. The winter squash. Come look at what I found this morning, Clara said. She showed him the basket. She named each plant as she lifted it, told him where she'd found it, told him in plain language what could be done with it. Lamb's quarters that tasted like spinach and grew in every disturbed piece of ground in the county, nettles that lost their sting when cooked and were more nutritious than most things Elias had ever deliberately planted. Purslane that was better than any garden green in the heat of summer. Wild onions that were sharper and more flavorful than anything out of the kitchen garden. Elias listened. He did not argue, which was not nothing. This isn't enough to get us through a winter, he said when she'd finished. Not yet. But there's more. There's a lot more. There's food out here, Elias. The beetles don't want any of it. She looked at him steadily. I've been watching this for years. I know where it is. I know what it is. I know what to do with it. He was quiet for a long time. The creek moved past them with its low sound, and somewhere downstream a heron called once and went silent. People are going to say things, Elias said quietly. If you go around telling people to eat weeds, they're going to say things. Clara picked up her basket and stood. She was not a tall woman, but she had the kind of physical presence that came from being comfortable in her own body in a way most people were not. People are already saying things, Elias, she said. They've been saying things for years. I've learned to get along without their approval. She started back toward the house, and after a moment, he followed her. Oh. She spent the rest of that day and all of the next covering ground. She worked the creek banks first, systematically, from the south boundary of their property up to the crossing near the old Whitfield place, cataloging everything that was growing and untouched. Then she moved to the fence lines, where wild things always established themselves in the neglected strips that were nobody's garden. She checked the edge of the timber, the disturbed ground around the old mill foundation, the low spots where water collected in spring. She came home each evening with full baskets and cataloged what she had in the root cellar, hanging bundles to dry, laying out flat stones in the cellar to keep things cool, packing purslane into crocks with salt the way her grandmother had taught her. Elias watched all of this. He did not help. Not yet. But he watched, and he carried the heavy baskets when she asked him to, and he stopped making comments about what the neighbors might think. On the 3rd day, Ruth Henderson appeared at the kitchen door. Ruth was a thin, anxious woman in her mid-30s who had come to Nebraska from Ohio with her husband and 4 children and Frank's absolute certainty that farming in the West was going to make them prosperous. Frank's absolute certainty had not survived contact with 3 years of weather and 1 year of beetles, and Ruth's nerves had paid the price. She knocked twice and then opened the door before Clara could answer, which was typical of Ruth Henderson. She had no patience for waiting. I heard you've been gathering, Ruth said, standing in the doorway with a look on her face that couldn't quite decide whether it was hopeful or suspicious. Luella Marsh told me. She said you were down by the creek with a basket. I was, Clara said. She was at the table sorting a pile of dried lamb's quarters into bundles. Sit down if you want. Ruth sat, but she sat on the edge of the chair like a woman who wasn't sure she was going to stay. Can you really eat those things? The stuff that grows wild? I've been eating them for years. Ruth looked at the bundles on the table. She looked at the strings of drying plants hanging from the ceiling joists. She looked at Clara in that direct, unsettled way she had, like a woman reassessing something she thought she already understood. Frank says it's what desperate people do, Ruth said. Eat weeds. Clara kept working. Frank says a lot of things. He does, Ruth agreed, with a small, tired sound that might have been a laugh. The lamb's quarters taste like spinach, Clara said. Better than spinach, actually. The nettles? Once you cook them, you can't even tell. There's wild onion that makes everything better. Purslane is better than any salad green I've ever grown on purpose. She paused. Your children eat spinach? They eat what I put in front of them, Ruth said. Then they'll eat this. Clara looked up. I can show you where to find it. I can show you what's safe and what to leave alone. It won't be hard to learn. Most of it you've probably walked past 1,000 times. Ruth stared at her for a moment, Then she said in a smaller voice than usual, "Martha won't eat anything anymore. She's 8 and she's decided she's not hungry, which I think means she knows something is wrong and she's scared. The little ones follow whatever she does." Clara set down her work. "Bring Martha tomorrow morning. Bring all of them. We'll go out to the creek and they can help find things. Children are good at it." She paused. "It'll be harder for her to decide she's not hungry if she's the one who found her dinner." Ruth Henderson looked at her for a long moment. Then she straightened in her chair and her expression settled into something more like resolution. "What time?" she said. They went out the next morning, Ruth and her 4 children, and Clara carrying a basket and a patience she had developed over years of dealing with a world that moved at its own pace and couldn't be hurried. Martha was the oldest, a serious-faced girl with her father's stubborn jaw, who walked through the world with her arms crossed, and her suspicion plainly visible. The 3 younger ones, 2 boys and a girl barely past toddling, were interested in everything in the undiscriminating way small children were interested in everything, which made them excellent foragers. Clara started with the purslane because it was the easiest. It grew in low, spreading mats in the gravel near the water's edge, with round leaves and slightly reddish stems. And it was impossible to misidentify and impossible to overlook once you'd had it pointed out to you. "Is it really food?" the older boy asked, squatting down to look at it. His name was George, and he was 10, and deeply skeptical in the way 10-year-old boys could be. "Pick a leaf and eat it," Clara said. He looked at her. He looked at the leaf. He picked it and put it in his mouth with the expression of someone expecting punishment. "It's sour," he said, surprised. "A little. It has a kind of lemon taste. You like lemon?" "I like pie," George said. "Well, I can't do pie right now, but I can do a salad that tastes better than anything out of your mother's kitchen garden." She watched his face. "Your father thinks this is what desperate people eat." "He does," George said. "What do you think?" He chewed thoughtfully. He picked another leaf and ate that one too. "I think if I'm going to be hungry, I'd rather be hungry somewhere I could find something to eat." Clara looked at him for a moment and felt something move in her chest. Something that was not quite pride, not quite grief, but somewhere in between. 10 years old and already more practical than half the adults in the valley. "That," she said, "is exactly right." Martha had been standing apart this whole time, watching with her arms still crossed. She was not a child who committed to things quickly. But Clara noticed her watching George eat the purslane, and then watching the youngest Henderson girl crouch in the gravel and carefully, systematically, eat 4 leaves in a row with growing satisfaction. "What's that one?" Martha said finally, pointing to a stand of tall plants a few feet away. "Lamb's quarters," Clara said. "Want to know how to tell it?" Martha unfolded her arms. But word traveled. The way word traveled in small valleys, through back fences and borrowed tools, and the conversations that happened at the communal well where several of the farms still drew their water. By the end of that first week, Clara had 3 families coming to her. By the end of the second week, she had 8. She took them out in the mornings, different groups on different days, walking the creek banks and the fence lines and the disturbed ground around the old structures at the north end of the valley. She showed them what to take and what to leave. She showed them which plants came back more abundantly when harvested correctly, and which ones needed to be left alone to seed. She showed them how to tell the safe things from the handful of plants that would make them sick. She was patient with the ones who were frightened. She was matter-of-fact with the ones who were proud and didn't want to admit they needed teaching. She was gentle with the children and direct with the men, who generally responded to information presented without apology. Not everyone came. There were families who had enough stored to wait and see. There were families where the husband had decided the whole thing was beneath them and his wife was not in a position to disagree. There were 2 or 3 households at the far end of the valley who had always kept themselves slightly separate from the rest of the community and who were not going to change that practice because of beetles. And there was Mildred Boone. Mildred Boone was 53 years old and had lived in Ash Hollow for 27 of them, and in that time she had established herself as the kind of person that small communities produce and then somehow cannot figure out how to manage. A woman with a great deal of energy, a comprehensive knowledge of everyone's business, and an absolute certainty that her judgment was correct. She was not a cruel person exactly. She was simply a person who had learned early that information was power and that the most reliable source of information was watching other people closely and interpreting what she saw according to her existing beliefs about the world. Her existing belief about Clara Ashbourne was that the woman was an embarrassment, too heavy, too unconventional, too comfortable doing things that didn't look right from a distance. Mildred Boone believed strongly in the importance of how things looked from a distance. She had come to the well on a Tuesday afternoon when Clara was there filling her bucket, and she had said, in the bright, cheerful tone she used for observations that were not meant to be friendly, "I see you've been giving the Henderson children a lesson in eating garbage." Clara had turned around and looked at her with that steady look she had, the one that made some people feel she could see straight through to what they were actually saying. "I've been giving the Henderson children a lesson in edible wild plants. Ruth's garden is gone. So's yours. So's mine." "My family," Mildred said, with the particular precision of someone delivering information for maximum effect, "has no intention of eating things that grow in ditches." "That's your choice," Clara said. "I hope you have enough set by." Mildred's eyes flickered, just briefly, in a way that suggested that topic was not entirely comfortable. "Some of us know how to prepare properly." "Mildred," Clara said, in the patient voice of someone who has stopped being hurt by things and has moved on to simply observing them, "if you get hungry enough, you know where I am." She picked up her full bucket and walked home, and she did not look back. The first time Elias tasted the nettle soup, he stood at the stove with a bowl in both hands and ate the whole thing before he said a word. Clara watched him from the table, her own bowl in front of her, waiting. He set the empty bowl down. He looked at it. He looked at her. "That," he said, "was not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "I don't know. Grass, something that tasted like the ground." "Does it taste like the ground?" He picked up the bowl again and looked into it as though more soup might appear if he looked hard enough. "It tastes like... I don't know what it tastes like. Something good. Nettle, wild onion, a little of the dried purslane I put up last week, some salt." He set the bowl down again. "Could you make more?" It was not an apology. Elias was not a man who apologized easily, and she did not expect it. But it was something. It was in its way the most significant thing he had said to her in 4 years of marriage. Because what it meant was, "You were right, and I should have listened, and I'm listening now." "I could make considerably more," Clara said. "I found a patch of lamb's quarters yesterday the size of this kitchen, enough to feed us and 6 other families for a month if we're careful." Elias was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "You know what I keep thinking about?" "What?" "All those years you walked the creek, all those baskets." He shook his head slowly. "I kept thinking you were doing something that didn't make sense, wasting time." "I know." "And the whole time, I wasn't wasting time." "No?" He looked at her with an expression that was new on his face. Or maybe it had been there before and she hadn't recognized it, or maybe he hadn't let it show. It was something close to genuine wonder. "No, you weren't." She reached across the table and put her hand over his. His hand was rough and dry from the field work, the knuckles slightly enlarged from years of labor, and he turned it over and held hers in that way she had always loved about him, without thinking, without performing, just holding. "What do we do now?" he asked. "Now," Clara said, "we feed people." The next morning, Elias got up before Clara did. When she came downstairs, he was standing at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and a pencil, making a list. "I thought," he said, not looking up, "that we could section off the teaching, north end of the creek to the Henderson place. I could take groups Monday and Wednesday. You take the south end, you know it better. Whoever wants to learn..." He stopped. He still wasn't looking at her. "I know I should have said this before," he said. "I know I should have listened." He put the pencil down. "I'm sorry it took me this long to understand what you were doing." Clara looked at him, at his broad shoulders and his calloused hands, and his face that was braced for her response the way a man braces when he's said a hard thing and isn't sure how it will land. "You're here now," she said. He looked up, finally, and she let him see that she meant it. Not as a consolation, not as the lesser version of what she'd wanted. He was here now, which was real, and what was real was what they had to work with. "I'm here now," he agreed. He picked the pencil back up and went back to his list, and Clara poured 2 cups of coffee and set one beside him and sat down at the table across from him, and they made their plan together in the early morning quiet before the valley woke. Outside, the creek moved south through untouched stands of lamb's quarters and nettles and purslane. A whole pantry no one had planted and no beetle had touched. The summer was brutal and the farms were ruined and the winter ahead was going to be long. But Clara Ashbourne had already been paying attention. The plan they made that morning at the kitchen table turned out to be harder than either of them had anticipated, which was also not something either of them had anticipated. The first problem was the men. The women came readily enough. Ruth Henderson was already a convert, and Ruth talked, and the women she talked to other women. And within 4 days, Clara had more students than she could manage on her own. The women brought their children, and the children brought the unself-conscious curiosity of the very young. And the whole enterprise along the South Creek bank had the chaotic, slightly overwhelming energy of a one-room schoolhouse where the teacher had badly underestimated enrollment. The men were another matter. It wasn't that they refused outright. Outright refusal would have been something Clara could have worked with. What they did instead was what men in the valley had always done with things they didn't understand or couldn't control. They found ways to be somewhere else. They had fences to check, equipment to see to, horses that needed attention. They sent their wives and waited to see what came back. Elias had the same problem with the men he tried to approach. He came home the second evening looking like a man who had been having a version of the same frustrating conversation since morning. "Frank Henderson won't come out," he said, sitting down at the table and putting his head in his hands in the way he had. "I talked to him for 20 minutes. He kept saying Ruth was handling it." "Ruth is handling it," Clara said. "Ruth's been handling it better than Frank has. I know that. But if Frank Henderson won't come, the Marsh boys won't come. And if the Marsh boys won't come, half the north end of the valley is going to spend this winter eating through their stores and praying for spring." He paused. Not that prayer is the issue. "What did Frank actually say?" Elias was quiet for a moment. Then, "He said a man who feeds his family on weeds isn't much of a man." Clara set down the bundle she was tying and turned to look at him. She looked at him for a long moment without saying anything. "He's going to be very hungry," she said finally, "and very embarrassed about it." "Probably." Elias looked up. "I don't know how to fix that. I can't make a man want something he's decided is beneath him." "No," Clara agreed. "You can't." She picked her bundle back up and went back to tying. "But his children are going to be hungry too, and that he can't make a decision about. When his children are hungry enough, Frank Henderson will figure out where his pride actually stands in the order of things." Elias looked at her. "That seems like a hard way to learn something." "It is," Clara said, without particular satisfaction. "But some people can't learn it any other way." She was right about Frank Henderson. She was right in a way that was not pleasant for anyone, including Clara, who took no comfort in being right about hard things. It happened 3 weeks into August, on a Tuesday afternoon that had the particular flat, airless heat of the summer's worst days. Clara was in her kitchen making a batch of nettle dumplings. She had gotten the technique right on the 4th attempt, adding a little rendered fat and working the dough less than she would for regular flour dumplings so they held their shape in the broth, when she heard boots on the porch steps. Not the light, quick steps of one of the Henderson children, not the measured tread she recognized as Elias. Heavier than that, slower. She opened the door before the knock. Frank Henderson was standing on her porch with his hat in his hands and his jaw set in the rigid way of a man who has made a decision that cost him something. He was a tall man, broad across the shoulders, the kind of physical presence that usually required more space than a porch allowed. Right now, he looked like he was taking up less space than usual. "Frank," she said. "Mrs. Ashbourne?" He turned his hat. He looked past her into the kitchen and then back at her. "I came to... Ruth said you're teaching people." "I am." She said... He stopped. He set his jaw harder. "My boy George, he's been eating things he found himself up along the fence line. He says you showed him." "I did." Frank nodded slowly. His eyes moved to the pot on her stove. "I'd appreciate it if you showed me the same. If you're willing." Clara stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. "There's broth on. I'll start from the beginning." He came in and sat at her table with his hat in his lap and his back straight, and Clara taught him the same things she'd taught his wife and his children. only now she taught him without the softening she used with people who came frightened. Frank Henderson had not come frightened. He'd come through the door that had cost him, and that deserved a different kind of respect. When he left 2 hours later, he had a list in his shirt pocket written in Clara's handwriting and a bundle of dried lamb's quarters under his arm, and, though he would never have said this aloud and possibly didn't fully understand it himself, a different sense of what the valley contained than he'd had when he arrived. "Thank you," he said at the porch steps, putting his hat back on. "For not—" He didn't finish the sentence. "You're welcome, Frank," Clara said. She watched him walk back up the track toward his property, and then she went inside and sat down at the kitchen table for a few minutes by herself before anyone else could appear and need something, because she had learned to take those minutes when she could find them. Word of what Clara was doing had by now traveled well past the immediate neighborhood and into the wider population of the valley. This was a thing with two sides, and Clara had the clear-eyed understanding that the second side was coming even as she appreciated the first. The first side was practical and good. Families who might have gone hungry were learning to supplement their wrecked gardens with the reliable abundance of wild things. Clara's kitchen had become a kind of informal teaching kitchen, where women came with questions and left with answers and dried bundles, and occasionally recipes they hadn't expected to be interested in. Children who had never looked at the ground as anything other than something to walk on were developing a detailed, particular knowledge of what grew in their own county. The valley was not thriving. The beetle damage was real, and the stored supplies were already showing the stress of feeding families without their usual garden yield. But it was not starving, and that was not nothing. The second side was that people who are frightened and dependent are not always grateful, and gratitude in particular has a short half-life when the emergency continues long enough for people to forget how bad it was before the help arrived. Clara saw the second side coming. She saw it in the way certain women began to hold their questions back, as though asking Clara something had started to feel like admitting something they weren't comfortable admitting. She saw it in the slight shift in the conversations at the well, not unfriendly exactly, but careful in a way they hadn't been careful before. She saw it most clearly in the way Mildred Boone had started watching her. Mildred had come to the creek bank on a Wednesday in the third week of August. She had not come with the other women. She had come alone, appearing at the edge of the bank above where Clara was working with a group of the Morrison children, and she had watched for a while without coming down or saying anything. When Clara looked up and met her eyes, Mildred had turned and walked away. She had not said a word. She had not asked to be taught. But she had come, which meant she was looking, and Mildred Boone looking was never a comfortable thing. Clara didn't say anything to Elias about it. She put it in the back of her mind where she kept things that she couldn't act on yet, and she went on with what she was doing. The dumplings were the thing that changed people's minds, or at least bent them. This was something Clara understood about human nature, that you could tell a person a thing was good and safe and nourishing until you were exhausted from telling them, and they would find reasons to doubt you, and those reasons would have less to do with evidence than with the discomfort of changing their minds. But if you put a bowl of something in front of a person that smelled extraordinary and tasted better than they expected, the calculation changed. People were, at root, people who wanted to eat things that tasted good. That desire was older and more reliable than almost any other quality they possessed. So Clara made the dumplings, and she made the soups, and she made the pickled purslane that tasted bright and sharp and could be eaten alongside almost anything. And she made a dried herb mixture from wild things that improved whatever it was added to in a way that was slightly hard to explain but very easy to taste. And she fed people, not just the women who came to learn. She started bringing food to the families who hadn't come at all, showing up at doors with a pot or a bundle with a note about how to use it, leaving things on porches when no one answered. She didn't make a production of it. She didn't wait to be thanked. She just left the food and went home. This created a problem for Mildred Boone that was more complicated than Mildred had anticipated. You could not easily disapprove of a woman who was feeding your neighbors. You could have opinions about her appearance and her methods and the general effect she had on the community's sense of proper order. Mildred Boone had always had these opinions, and they were not going away simply because Clara had turned out to be useful. But usefulness had a social weight that was difficult to argue with, and Mildred was finding that her observations about Clara were being received differently than they had been in June. People who had once nodded along when she described Clara's creekbank wanderings as eccentric and slightly ridiculous were now deflecting the conversation, or worse, defending the woman outright. "She showed my Margaret how to tell the safe mushrooms," Agnes Morrison had said 2 weeks ago, when Mildred made a remark at the well that she had considered fairly mild. "I don't care if she walks the creek bank from here to the Missouri River. My children have had something green on the table every single day since she started teaching." Mildred had changed the subject. But she had not changed her mind, because Mildred Boone's mind was not an organ that changed direction quickly or under pressure. What she had done instead was begin to watch more carefully, looking for something she could point to that was concrete and defensible, something that was not just a matter of aesthetics or propriety, but of actual harm. She found what she was looking for, or thought she did, on a Friday afternoon in the first week of September. Clara heard about the Pierce boys secondhand, the way she heard about most things that had to do with Mildred Boone, through Ruth Henderson, who had it from Agnes Morrison, who had it from old Sadie Whitfield, who lived at the north end of the valley, and heard everything. The Pierce boy was 11 years old, the youngest of the 3 Pierce children, and he had been sick for going on 4 days with a fever that had his mother, Delia, nearly out of her mind with worry. He had started with a headache, then a stomach complaint, then the fever proper. By the time word reached Clara, it was Sunday, and the boy was on his 4th day of keeping almost nothing down. "The doctor is coming from Dunning," Ruth told her, sitting across the table with a coffee cup she wasn't drinking from. "But it'll be Tuesday before he can get out here." "Has anyone been able to see him? Do they know what—" "Mildred Boone, Ruth said, in the precise tone of someone delivering news they expect to be unwelcome, "has been telling people the boy ate something from your lessons." Clara set down her cup. "She's saying he ate the wrong mushroom," Ruth went on, quickly, like someone pulling a splinter. Better done fast. "Or the wrong plant. She doesn't have a specific claim. She's just saying it around, connecting the timing." "The timing," Clara said. "He ate from your teaching, is what she's saying, and then he got sick." Clara sat with that for a moment. She thought about the Pierce children. The oldest had come to the creek twice in August. A serious girl named Ellen, who had taken notes on a scrap of paper in a handwriting so careful and deliberate it had made Clara feel something protective. She didn't specifically remember the youngest boy being there. "Did the Pierce children come to the creek?" she asked. Ellen did. Twice. Ruth pressed her lips together. Whether the boy had anything she brought home, Delia's not saying anything. She's too frightened to talk about it. She just keeps saying her boy is sick and crying, which, yes, I know. But it doesn't make Mildred right. "No," Clara said. "It doesn't." "What are you going to do?" Clara thought about it. She thought about what was available to her. She could go to the Pierce house and try to talk to Delia, but Delia was frightened, and grief had a way of making people cling to explanations, even bad ones. She could confront Mildred Boone directly, but Mildred's power was in what she said in other people's presence, not in direct argument, and a public confrontation would give the story more oxygen, not less. She could do nothing and wait for the doctor to come on Tuesday and correct the record, but 2 days was a long time for a story to travel in a valley that had nothing else to talk about. She looked out the window at the late afternoon light on the fields, and something settled in her that had nothing to do with decision and everything to do with character. The particular quality of a person who has learned that the right action is not always the one that makes the most strategic sense, but simply the one that is right. "I'm going to take food to old Mrs. Whitfield," she said. Ruth blinked. "Sadie Whitfield? She lives all the way at the north end." "I know where she lives." "Clara, that's—" Ruth stopped. "Why Sadie Whitfield?" "Because she's 81 years old, and she lives alone, and she's been eating what I've been bringing her every week, and she's been perfectly well. And she's also the most respected woman in this valley. And if I eat a meal at Sadie Whitfield's table and she is alive and healthy on the other side of it, that is a more effective argument than anything I could say to anyone." Clara stood up. "Also, she's 81 and lives alone, and it's September and the nights are getting cold, and she probably needs someone to check on her." Ruth stared at her. Then, slowly, she began to nod. The way a person nods when they've just understood something they should have seen from the beginning. "I'll come with you," Ruth said. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." Ruth stood up and pushed back her chair. "Tell me what to bring." They walked to the north end of the valley in the late afternoon, Clara with a covered pot and a cloth bag, Ruth with a basket, and the slightly breathless quality of a woman who had made a decision and was going to stick to it even though she was nervous. The light came down flat and golden through the dry grass beside the track, and somewhere ahead of them a meadowlark made its last sound of the day and went quiet. Sadie Whitfield's house was small and low, set back from the track behind an overgrown lilac hedge that had been magnificent once and was still impressive in a wild, uncurated way. Sadie herself opened the door before they reached the porch. She had that particular alertness of people who live alone and are attuned to any sound of approach. She was a tiny woman, bird-like, with white hair pinned severely back and eyes that were still sharp as anything. She had been a widow for 11 years and had declined every suggestion that she move into town or in with any of her surviving children, on the grounds that she had lived in this house for 40 years and she intended to die in it in her own time, not in a room in somebody else's house where she'd have to be grateful for the space. "Clara Ashbourne," she said, looking at them from the doorway with an expression of complete unsurprise. "And Ruth Henderson, come in out of the air. Out." The inside of Sadie's house had the layered smell of decades of living, dried herbs and wood smoke, and something floral that might have been the last of the summer's lavender from the garden plot on the south side. It was tidy in the way of someone who had come to a final, permanent arrangement with their own belongings, everything in the place it had been for years. They sat at Sadie's kitchen table, which was exactly large enough for 3 people and 1 pot of soup, and Clara served them all from the pot she'd carried up, and they ate. Lamb's quarters and wild onion and dried purslane and the nettles that she had, through weeks of iteration, learned to handle in a way that made them silky and mild and more delicious than anything their name suggested. Sadie ate steadily, with the appreciation of someone who had eaten a great many things in 81 years and could still distinguish good from less good. "Someone's been saying things," Sadie said. It was not a question. "Someone has," Clara agreed. "The Pierce boy." "He's sick with something. 4 days." Sadie nodded. She was quiet for a moment, eating. Then, "My grandson had the same thing last summer, before the Beatles, before any of this." She gestured toward the soup in a way that encompassed Clara's whole enterprise. "Headache, stomach, fever, 4 days. Delia Pierce knows that because my granddaughter played with her boy all last summer and she came to see how he was." Clara and Ruth both looked at her. "Summer fever," Sadie said with the flat certainty of someone who has seen enough seasons to recognize the pattern. "It goes around every few years, follows the same creek that the Beatles followed, more or less." She picked up her spoon again. "Nothing to do with weeds. Nothing to do with what this woman has been feeding people." Ruth said quietly, "Have you told anyone that?" Sadie's expression was dry. "I'm 81 years old and I live at the end of a track that half the valley's forgotten about. Nobody comes to ask me things." She looked at Clara steadily. "Until now." The 3 of them sat at the table for another hour after the soup was finished, and Sadie told them things she knew about the valley and the summer fevers and the particular progression of illness that the Pierce boy was experiencing. And Clara listened to all of it with the quality of attention she brought to things that the creek bank had taught her. Careful, respectful, understanding that knowledge accumulated in a person over decades was not a smaller thing than the knowledge in a book. When they left, the sun was fully down and the evening star was visible above the ridge. They walked back south in the cooling dark, Ruth carrying the empty pot, Clara carrying the empty bag, both of them quieter than they'd been on the way out. "She's going to tell people," Ruth said after a while. "What she told us, isn't she?" "She said she would," Clara said. "Will they listen to her?" Clara thought about Sadie Whitfield's eyes, the sharpness in them, the weight of authority that came from simply having outlasted everyone's objections by a sufficient number of years. "Yes," she said, "I think they'll listen to her." They walked the rest of the way in silence, the dark valley opening around them, the creek somewhere to their left running its quiet, reliable sound over stones it had been running over for longer than anyone in Ash Hollow could remember. Clara was not unafraid. She understood what the next few days were going to look like. The talk at the well, the avoidances, the families who would decide that uncertainty was sufficient reason to pull back. She understood that Mildred Boone had done something tonight that was not going to be easily undone by one old woman's testimony, however trusted that woman was. But she was also, underneath the fear, something else. She was the woman who had walked the creek banks for 4 years while people laughed. She was the woman who had filled her baskets while her neighbors planted their rows. She had spent years knowing things that no one was interested in knowing, and she had kept knowing them anyway, without anyone's encouragement and against a fair amount of active discouragement. She was not, she had discovered about herself, a person who could be frightened out of what she knew. She walked home through the September dark with her empty bag over her shoulder, and she put one foot in front of the other the way she always did, and she went on. Sadie Whitfield was as good as her word. She came into the valley proper on a Monday morning, which was the first time in 3 weeks she had made the walk from the north end, and she came with the deliberate purposefulness of a woman who had decided something and was going to see it through regardless of what her knees had to say about it. She stopped at the well first, where Agnes Morrison and 2 of the Marsh women were drawing water, and she told them what she had told Clara and Ruth on Friday evening. The summer fever, her grandson, the fact that this same sickness had moved through the valley's children before, would move through again, had nothing to do with what any woman was feeding anyone. She said it plainly and without dramatics, because Sadie Whitfield, at 81, had long since shed any interest in performance. She simply stated what she knew, named the years she was drawing from, and let the weight of 8 decades of watching this valley do the work that argument couldn't. Agnes Morrison listened with her arms folded and her head tilted, and then said, "Well, that's what I thought, but you know how talk gets started," in the tone of someone who had been privately uncertain and was relieved to be given permission to stop being uncertain. The Marsh women were quieter. They listened and nodded and took their water and left, and Clara, who heard all of this from Ruth the same afternoon, understood that quiet and nodding from the Marsh women was not the same as agreement. It was the particular silence of people who were not yet ready to release the story they'd been carrying, because releasing a story you've been carrying requires admitting you picked it up in the first place. What Sadie's walk into the valley did, as far as Clara could assess, was stop the bleeding. It didn't reverse it. The damage that Mildred Boone's whisper campaign had done in those first 2 days, the families who had stopped coming to the creek bank, the women who had gone from easy conversation to careful nods, the specific chilly quality of the silence that now greeted Clara at the well. That damage was still there, sitting in the valley like a smell that wouldn't clear. Sadie had contained it. She had not cured it. And then the letter arrived. Clara found it on Tuesday morning, slipped under the kitchen door sometime before dawn. It was written on the back of a piece of brown paper, in handwriting that was deliberate enough to be disguised. The letters formed too carefully, the way people wrote when they were trying not to be recognized. It said, "Your weeds made the Pierce boys sick. Everyone knows it. If you care about this valley, stop what you're doing before you hurt another child." She read it twice. She stood in the early morning light of her kitchen with the paper in her hands and read it twice. And then she folded it carefully and put it in the pocket of her apron and stood there for a moment looking at the window over the sink, at the way the dawn was coming up gray and flat behind the eastern ridge. Elias was still upstairs. She could hear him moving around, the sound of his boots on the floor, the particular creak of the second board from the top of the stairs that she had heard every morning of their marriage. She thought about whether to show him the letter and decided, while the stairs were still creaking, that she would. He read it standing at the kitchen table, one hand on the back of a chair, and she watched his face go through several things in quick succession. First the sharp tightening around the eyes that was his version of alarm, then something harder and flatter that she recognized as anger, then a long exhale through his nose that meant he was pushing the anger somewhere, he could deal with it later. "Do you know who wrote it?" he said. "No." He looked at her. "Do you have a guess?" "I have a guess. I'm not going to say it out loud." He set the paper down. He looked at it. "I want to go talk to people." "I know you do." "Clara, it's..." "And say what? That someone left a note?" She kept her voice even. "Anyone who's inclined to believe this is already believing it. Anyone who isn't won't be changed by you arguing about an anonymous letter." He pressed his lips together. "So we do nothing." "We do what we've been doing," she said. "We keep going." The look on his face was not one she'd seen often, a kind of frustrated helplessness that sat badly on a man who was more accustomed to problems he could fix with his hands. He picked up the letter again and held it for a moment, and then he set it back down with a precision that told her something about how hard he was working to keep his response measured. "I hate this," he said. "I know. You've been feeding people for 2 months. You've kept half this valley from going hungry. And someone writes you a... He stopped. Someone is frightened, Clara said. They want a reason for why a child is sick that isn't just bad luck and the ordinary unfairness of things. I'm available. I'm convenient. She paused. And I'm the overweight woman who wanders the creek banks picking weeds, and that has always made some people comfortable with thinking less of me. Elias was quiet for a moment. Then, with the careful directness of a man who is genuinely trying, does that still hurt? What people say about... Yes, Clara said simply. It still hurts. He nodded. He didn't try to fix that, which was the right instinct. He just stood there and let it be true. We keep going, she said again. He picked up his coffee cup and stood there a moment longer. Then we keep going. The second letter came on Thursday. The third came on Saturday. The third one was different from the first two. More specific, more hostile. Not just suggesting she stop, but stating that if she continued, she would regret it. Clara read it standing at the kitchen door where she'd found it, in the early morning quiet, and something in her chest went cold and tight in a way that had nothing to do with the cooling September air. She did not show this one to Elias. She put it with the other two in the back of the bread box where she kept things she hadn't decided what to do with, and she went about her morning. She made her coffee, and she ate her breakfast, and she started a pot of soup because there were 3 families that week who hadn't been out and hadn't sent anyone, and she'd been planning to take them something. She did all of this with the mechanical efficiency of a woman who knows that if she stops moving, she'll have to think about something she's not ready to think about yet. The thinking came later when Elias was in the fields and the kitchen was quiet and the soup was simmering. She sat down at the table with her coffee going cold beside her and looked at the wall above the stove where she'd hung a small mirror that her mother had given her, the one with the wooden frame that had cracked on the left side and been repaired with a strip of leather thong. She looked at her own face in it, her broad jaw, her dark eyes, the way her hair was already coming loose from the knot she'd pinned it in that morning. She was, she knew, not an easy woman for this valley to see clearly. She had understood that from the time she was a child, when she had been the heavy girl with the strange interests who didn't fit the shape that girls were supposed to fit. She had married a good man who loved her and was embarrassed by her in roughly equal measure. She had spent 4 years being quietly dismissed by people who considered her odd and slightly pitiable. And she had spent those same 4 years learning things that would now, in the right circumstances, keep those same people's children alive. The problem was the right circumstances had a quality she hadn't fully prepared for. She had prepared for the hard work. She had prepared for the skepticism. She had even prepared, in a general way, for the resistance that came when people didn't want to need you. What she had not prepared for was the way fear could reach into a community and reshape something as simple and human as gratitude, turning it sour, turning it into the exact opposite of what it should have been. She had given these people something real, and some of them were now turning it into a reason to be afraid of her. That was the thing that sat in her chest, not entirely like hurt, not entirely like anger, somewhere in between, with a quality of exhaustion underneath it. She heard boots on the porch steps and looked up. The knock was quick and businesslike. It was Agnes Morrison, holding a basket with a cloth over it and wearing the expression of a woman who had been working up to something for several days. "I came to bring this back," Agnes said when Clara opened the door. She held out the basket. Inside it were 2 crocks of the pickled purslane Clara had given her the week before, and the sight of them, returned unused, landed in Clara's stomach like a stone. She looked at Agnes. Agnes had the decency to look uncomfortable. "Margaret's been asking for it," Agnes said. "She'd eat it every day if I let her, but my husband—" She stopped. She pressed her lips together. "He's not... He thinks it would be better until things get sorted out if we—" "Agnes," Clara said. "Your husband thinks my food made the Pierce boy sick." Agnes didn't answer, which was its own answer. "The doctor is coming Tuesday," Clara said. "He'll tell you what made the boy sick. And when he does—" "I know," Agnes said quickly, too quickly. "I know it's probably not—" "It's not," Clara said. "You know it's not." Agnes stood there for a moment with the basket extended between them like something she wanted Clara to take back. There was genuine distress in her face. The distress of a woman who knew what she was doing was wrong, and was doing it anyway because the other option required a kind of courage she couldn't locate at the moment. Clara took the basket. She took it without anger because anger at Agnes Morrison right now was not something she had room for. "You know where I am," Clara said, "when things get sorted out." Agnes left quickly, without looking back, and Clara stood in the kitchen doorway with the basket in her hands and watched her go. She put the crocks back in the root cellar. She went back to her soup. She added a handful of dried wild onion to the pot and stirred it and tasted it and adjusted the salt. Outside, the creek kept running. The lambs' quarters kept growing. Whatever anyone in the valley decided to believe for the next few days, the land itself didn't have an opinion about it, and that was, in its way, a comfort. The doctor came on Tuesday, as promised, or rather, as close to promised as a man traveling from Dunning in early fall could manage, which meant Tuesday afternoon rather than Tuesday morning. His name was Haverford, and he was a compact, graying man of 50 who had been doctoring in the county for long enough to have delivered most of the children in the valley and treated most of their subsequent illnesses. He was not a man given to either reassurance or alarm. He had the particular flatness of manner that came from spending decades with frightened people and learning that the most useful thing was usually to simply state what was true. He spent an hour with the Pierce boy. He came out of the house and found Delia Pierce and half a dozen concerned neighbors waiting in the yard, and he looked at all of them with his flat, assessing expression and said without preamble, "Summer fever, same thing that went through the valley 2 years ago. Nothing to do with what the child ate. Everything to do with this time of year and this particular drainage." He looked at Delia. "He needs water and rest and to be kept cool through the nights. He'll be fine by Friday." Silence. "What drainage?" someone asked. Clara couldn't see who from where she was standing at the back edge of the small gathered group. "The Eastern Creek," Haverford said. "Same as last time. The fever follows the flooding in wet years, but it can appear in any year. I've seen it twice in this valley in 20 years and 4 times in the county." He picked up his bag. "The child was not poisoned. He was sick, which is a different thing entirely." He left the way he'd come, which was efficiently and without ceremony, and the yard was very quiet after his horse moved back down the track. Clara was standing at the back of the group, and she stayed there while people talked. She watched it happening in front of her. The small readjustments, the way eyes moved sideways toward other eyes, the particular quality of a group of people who have all just understood they were wrong and are still in the first moments of that understanding before the embarrassment sets in and the self-justification starts and the whole machinery of retrospective explanation begins. She watched Mildred Boone standing at the near edge of the group, slightly apart from the others, with her hands clasped in front of her, and her face arranged in the expression of someone who is not currently saying anything and is aware that this is the correct choice. Mildred was not looking at Clara. She was not looking at anyone in particular. She was looking at a middle distance that contained nothing specific, and her jaw was set in the way of a person who has not yet decided what their position is going to be. Clara turned and walked home. She was sitting at the kitchen table when Elias came in that evening, earlier than usual, with the look of a man who had been somewhere and come back with news he needed to deliver. "Haverford cleared you," he said. "I heard." He sat down across from her. He was quiet for a moment, looking at his hands. "Mildred Boone was at the Morrison place this afternoon. Agnes told Ruth." He paused. "She was talking about the mushrooms again, saying Haverford didn't test for it specifically, saying there could be long-term—" "Elias," Clara said. He stopped. "I know," she said. "I know what she's saying." She looked at him steadily. "There's nothing I can do about what Mildred Boone says. There never was." "This is different," he said. "Before she was just making comments. Now it's more targeted. People are—" He pressed his lips together. "I had 3 men today who should have come out to learn the North Creek who didn't show up. No word, no explanation, just didn't come." Clara was quiet. "And Bert Marsh told me straight out that he's done with the foraging, that he doesn't trust—" Elias stopped again. He looked at her with an expression of genuine anger, but not at her. The kind of anger that comes from watching someone you love be treated badly and being unable to prevent it. He said he doesn't trust the source. "He doesn't trust me," Clara said. "He doesn't deserve—" "No, it's all right." She smoothed the table in front of her with her palm, a small, unconscious gesture. "I knew this was a possibility. I didn't know it would happen this way, but—" "It's not all right," Elias said. "You've been feeding his family for 2 months. His wife has been out at the creek bank twice a week since August. His children eat what you've taught them to find, and they've been fine and healthy and better fed than half the valley. And now Mildred Boone whispers something and he walks away. He shook his head. That's not something you just accept. I don't accept it, Clara said. I just can't spend my energy fighting it. He looked at her. What does that mean? It means, she thought about how to say it. It means I know what I know. I know what I've been doing. I know what the land has in it and what it's safe to eat and what it isn't, and I know that the Pierce boy had summer fever and not a single family I've taught has been sickened by anything I've shown them. And none of that changes because Mildred Boone is frightened of me for reasons that have nothing to do with mushrooms. Frightened of you? Clara smiled, a small and slightly tired smile. She's been watching me for years. She's never known what to do with me. I don't fit the shape of things she understands. That was fine when I was just the strange woman on the creek bank, but now I'm the strange woman on the creek bank that half the valley depends on. And that's a different problem for someone like Mildred. Elias looked at her for a long moment. I never thought about it that way. I know. She reached across the table the way she had before, and he took her hand the same way. I need you to keep going with the North Creek. The men who didn't show up today, give them a week. Some of them will come back when the dust settles. Some won't, and that's their choice. And the ones who are saying things? Let them say things. She held his hand. I'm going to keep feeding people, Elias. I'm not going to stop because someone is afraid of me, and I'm not going to stop because someone is trying to hurt me. There are families in this valley that will go hungry this winter if I stop, and that matters more than Mildred Boone's opinion of my intentions. He was quiet for a long time. The kitchen settled around them, the way kitchens do in the evening. The particular stillness of a house at the end of a day, the fire low, the light soft. All right, he said. All right? All right, we keep going. He squeezed her hand once and let it go and stood up. I'm going to go talk to Frank Henderson. If Frank will stand up at the well and say what he knows about what you've been doing, that's worth more than anything either of us can say directly. Clara watched him take his hat from the peg and put it on. Frank Henderson's standing up for me at the well, she said. That's something I wouldn't have predicted in August. A lot of things happened in August, Elias said, and opened the door and went out into the evening. Clara sat at the table for another minute after he left, in the quiet kitchen, with the sound of the creek just barely audible through the closed window. That low, steady, indifferent sound of water moving over stones, paying no attention to what people were saying at the well, or whose opinion was shifting, or what Mildred Boone was whispering to Agnes Morrison. She got up. She went to the stove. She put a new log on the fire. There was food to make for tomorrow, and tomorrow was going to be hard, and the day after tomorrow was going to be hard too, and she had long since made her peace with hard days, which was different from being unaffected by them and did not require that she pretend they didn't hurt. She picked up her spoon and went back to work. Frank Henderson did go to the well. He went on Wednesday morning, which was when the largest group of the valley's women typically gathered, the well being less a water source at that point and more a fixed location for the kind of conversation that required witness. Elias had talked to him Tuesday evening, and whatever passed between those two men in the 40 minutes they spent on the Henderson porch, it had been sufficient. Frank arrived at the well with the look of a man who had decided something and intended to see it through, which on Frank Henderson's face looked a great deal like stubbornness, but was in fact something more deliberate than that. Clara heard about it from Ruth the same afternoon, in the particular sequential way that news moved through the valley, from the well to Ruth's kitchen to Clara's, like water finding the path of least resistance. Ruth sat down and talked for 20 minutes without pausing, which was how Ruth processed events of significance. Frank had said, plainly and without much preamble, that his family had been eating what Clara Ashbourne taught them to find since August, and every one of them was healthy and well-fed. He said his boy George had more practical knowledge of this county's land than Frank himself had acquired in 15 years of farming it. He said the Pierce boy had summer fever, and Dr. Haverford had said so, and that was the end of that question as far as he was concerned. He said he'd been late to understanding what Clara was doing, and he wasn't proud of that. But he understood it now, and anyone who had questions about whether the food was safe could come eat a meal at his table and see for themselves. He said all of that? Clara asked. He said all of that, Ruth confirmed. Out loud. At the well. with Dorothea Marsh standing right there. Clara sat with that for a moment. Frank Henderson, who had stood on her porch in August with his hat in his hands and his pride barely contained, who had needed 2 full hours of plain teaching before he could accept the idea of eating something he hadn't planted himself, had stood at the common well and said her name and meant it as a defense. How did Dorothea take it? Clara asked. Ruth pressed her lips together in the way that meant the answer was complicated. She listened. She didn't argue. She filled her bucket and left. She paused. Dorothea Marsh listens more than she talks. When she makes up her mind about something, you generally find out after the fact. And Mildred? Wasn't there? Ruth said it in the specific, flat way that communicated the significance of an absence, which might mean she heard Frank was coming, or might mean nothing. It turned out to mean something. But the Pierce boy was on his feet by Friday, which was exactly when Dr. Haverford had said he would be. He appeared in the yard on Friday morning, pale and slightly thin from 4 days of keeping Little down, but upright and walking around with the particular indestructible quality of 11-year-old boys who have been ill and are now recovered and cannot quite understand why the adults in their vicinity are still treating them like something fragile. Delia Pierce came to Clara's door on Saturday. Clara opened it, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Delia was a quiet woman in ordinary circumstances. Not shy, but composed. The kind of person who thought before she spoke and meant what she said when she did. Right now, she was composed in a way that was clearly costing her something. Her hands were clasped in front of her, and her jaw was set, and her eyes were doing the particular thing eyes did when a person was working hard to keep them from doing something else. "My boy is well," Delia said. "I'm glad," Clara said, and meant it entirely. Dr. Haverford said. Delia stopped, tried again. "I never said your food made him sick. I want you to know that. I never said it to anyone." "I know you didn't," Clara said. "You were scared. That's different." Delia's composure slipped slightly, and she pressed her lips together hard before it could slip further. "I should have come sooner. When the talk started, I should have said something." "You had a sick child," Clara said. "You were where you were supposed to be." "Other people said it for me." Delia's voice was careful and tight. "I let other people say it, and that's the same as saying it myself, isn't it? Being quiet when someone's being lied about." Clara looked at her for a moment. She thought about the 3 letters in the back of her bread box, and she thought about Agnes Morrison returning the crocks of pickled purslane. And she thought about Bert Marsh and the men who hadn't shown up on the North Creek and the week of careful nods at the well. She thought about all of it, and she thought about Delia Pierce standing on her porch, with her composure costing her something. "Come in," Clara said. "I'll make tea." Delia came in. She sat at the table that had by now been sat at by half the valley, and she drank tea and she told Clara everything she knew about how the story had gotten started and who had said what to whom and in what order, and Clara listened with the quality of attention she had always been good at, the kind that didn't rush toward conclusions. Mildred Boone's name came up 3 times. 3 separate occasions, 3 separate conversations, Mildred at the center of each one. Not inventing facts, Mildred was too careful for that, but arranging what existed into a shape that pointed in one direction. The sick child, the timing, the unusual food, the woman no one had ever quite understood. "She's not a bad person," Delia said, and then immediately, "I don't know why I said that. Maybe she is." "She's a frightened person," Clara said, "but same thing I told my husband." "Frightened of what? You?" "Of things that don't fit where she thinks they should fit." Clara wrapped her hands around her cup. "I've been not fitting for a long time. That's uncomfortable for people who care about things fitting properly." Delia looked at her across the table. "I always thought you were... I didn't think about you much, honestly. I had my own family and my own work, and you were just..." She made a small, slightly helpless gesture. "You were just the woman who walked the creek." "That's all right," Clara said. "Most people didn't think about me much. I was all right with that. And now half the valley knows your name." "Half the valley knows my name for the wrong reasons," Clara said, with a dryness that made Delia almost laugh, surprised. "Maybe," Delia said, and then, "But Frank Henderson stood up at the well for you. That's not nothing. Frank Henderson doesn't stand up for much he hasn't personally tested and decided is worth it." "No," Clara agreed. "He doesn't." They sat for a while longer, the way women sometimes sat in kitchens when the conversation had found its level, and didn't need to go anywhere specific anymore. Outside, the September afternoon was going cool, the light thinning in the way it did this time of year when summer finally conceded the argument. When Delia left, she took with her a bundle of dried lamb's quarters and a small crock of the pickled purslane, and the name of the specific spot along the South Creek where the last of the season's watercress was still growing. She left without making any speeches about gratitude, which was the right instinct. She simply took what was offered and left, and that was its own kind of apology, and Clara accepted it as such. The following week, Sadie Whitfield came back down from the North End. This time, she didn't come just to the well. She came to Clara's door on a Tuesday morning with a walking stick she hadn't been using the last time, and a look on her face that said the walk had been harder than she'd expected, and she wasn't going to acknowledge that. "Sit down," Clara said immediately, moving toward the stove. "I'll get coffee." "I'm fine," Sadie said, and sat down with the deliberate care of someone who is fine but is choosing to sit anyway because sitting is practical. "I came because I heard about the letters." Clara turned from the stove. "Who told you about the letters?" "Ruth Henderson." Sadie's eyes were steady on her. "She said 3 letters, slipped under the door." Clara brought 2 cups to the table and sat down across from her. "The last one was a week ago, nothing since." "That's because Haverford cleared you and Frank Henderson talked at the well, and whoever was writing the letters lost the nerve for it." Sadie wrapped both hands around her cup and looked at Clara with the direct, unhurried way she had of looking at things. "I want to see them." "Sadie, I want to see them." Clara went to the bread box and brought back the 3 letters and set them on the table. Sadie picked them up one at a time and read each one and set it back down in the same careful way she set everything down. She read all 3 without changing her expression. Then she said, "All the same hand?" "I believe so," Clara said. "You know who wrote them?" "I have a strong suspicion," Clara said carefully. Sadie nodded slowly. "I want to tell you something," she said, "about this valley, about the way things work here." "All right." "I've lived here 40 years, Sadie said. "I've seen good summers and ruined summers. I've seen people get sick and recover and not recover. I've seen neighbors turn on each other over fences and water rights and things that mattered a great deal at the time, and nothing 10 years later." She paused. "And I've seen people do what you've been doing, feed their neighbors without being asked, and teach what they know without expecting thanks, and keep going when they're treated badly." She looked at Clara. "You know what happens to those people in this valley and every other one like it?" Clara waited. "They get remembered," Sadie said. "Not right away. Not while everyone's still frightened and embarrassed, but eventually they get remembered correctly." She picked up her coffee. "That's not nothing. I know it doesn't feel like much when you're in the middle of it, but it's not nothing." Clara looked at her hands on the table. "It doesn't fix what's broken," she said. "Some of those families that walked away, they may not come back. That's a real loss." "Some of them will come back," Sadie said, "and some won't, and that's their accounting, not yours." Clara stopped. Tried again. "I keep thinking about the ones who needed to learn and didn't because of what happened. The families at the far North End who were already cautious and now have a reason to stay away. If they go into winter without knowing what's available to them on their own land, then you go to them," Sadie said simply. Clara looked up. "You go to them directly," Sadie said. "Not the creek bank, not the teaching groups. You go to their door with food and you show them on their own land what grows there." She set her cup down. "Take me with you. People up that end know me. They'll open the door for me." "Sadie, that's a long walk. Every day." "Not every day. Enough days." The old woman's jaw was set in the way that meant the conversation about whether this was feasible was over. "I'm 81 years old, Clara. I'm not going to be 81 years old and sit at the north end of this valley watching people go hungry because they're too proud to come to you." She paused. "Also, I am bored, and the walk does my knees good whether they know it or not." Clara looked at her for a long moment, this small, fierce woman who had walked miles on difficult knees to come and say what she'd come to say. "All right," Clara said. "Thursday. I'll come to you first." "Come early," Sadie said. "I'm always up before the light." They went on Thursday and Friday, and again the following Monday, and Sadie was right that people opened their doors for her in a way they might not have opened them for Clara alone. Not because Sadie argued on Clara's behalf. She didn't, particularly. She just appeared on the porch beside her, and her 81 years and her 4 decades in the valley stood there with her like a form of testimony that required no words. The families at the north end were cautious, as Clara had expected. They listened more than they asked questions. They watched with a particular careful attention as Clara walked their fence lines and their creek-side ground and named what was there, and they did not commit to anything in the moment, but neither did they close their doors. One of them, a man named Callum, who had come to the valley only 6 years ago from further east and had always been slightly outside the network of relationships that connected the longer-established families, had followed Clara along his south fence line in silence for 20 minutes before he said anything. "My wife tried to come to your creek sessions," he said finally, "back in August. I told her not to." Clara kept walking. "Why?" "Because—" He stopped. He looked at the fence line, where a dense mat of purslane was growing in the gravel at the base of the posts, untouched by the beetles, green and healthy. "Because I didn't know you, and I'd heard things." "What things?" "The usual things." He said it with a bluntness that was its own kind of honesty. "That you were odd, that what you were doing was more about you than about helping people." Clara crouched down beside the purslane and looked at it. "Is that what you think now?" Callum was quiet for a moment. "I think Sadie Whitfield walked 3 miles to stand on my porch at 6 in the morning," he said. "That's not something people do for someone they don't trust." "No," Clara agreed. "It isn't." She showed him the purslane. She showed him the stand of lamb's quarters at the corner of his property, where 2 fence lines met, and the soil had been disturbed by an old post replacement, the kind of spot where the best wild things always grew. She showed him 3 varieties of wild onion that his family had been walking past for 6 years without knowing what they were. His wife appeared at the back door while they were still working the fence line, and then she came across the yard to them, and then her 2 daughters came behind her, and by the time Clara and Sadie left an hour later, the whole family was in the field, moving along the fence line together, the daughters asking questions in the rapid overlapping way of children who have found a new thing and cannot get enough of it. Callum shook Clara's hand when she left. His handshake was firm and direct, and said more than he would have been comfortable putting into words. "Come back," he said, "when there's more to show them." "I will," Clara said. The apologies, when they came, did not come in any organized way. They did not come as a group event or a public acknowledgement. They came the way things generally came in small communities, one at a time, in kitchens and at fence lines and along the creek bank, in the specific private moments that allowed a person to say something difficult without an audience. Agnes Morrison came on a Wednesday with her daughter Margaret, who was clutching the edge of her mother's skirt and looking at Clara with large, serious eyes. Agnes said what she'd come to say without preamble, which Clara respected. She said she'd known it was wrong to return the Crocs, and she'd done it anyway because her husband had pressured her and she'd been weak about it, and she was sorry. She said it quickly and clearly, like a woman pulling a splinter, and Clara received it the same way. Margaret, from the shelter of her mother's skirt, said, "Can I still come to the creek?" "Yes," Clara said. "I'll be there Friday morning." Bert Marsh came on a Thursday, alone, without his wife, which meant he'd come without telling anyone he was coming and intended to deal with it directly and privately. He stood at her kitchen door with the rigid discomfort of a man engaging in an activity that did not come naturally to him, and said that he'd been wrong to say he didn't trust her, and that Haverford's word was good enough for him and always had been, and he should have waited for it before he said anything. It was not, as apologies went, an elaborate one, but Bert Marsh had clearly spent some effort working up to it, and she accepted it for what it was. Some people didn't come. The anonymous letters had never been claimed and never would be, and Clara understood that the person who had written them was not going to be among the ones who came to her door. That was all right. She had not expected that resolution, and she had made her peace with the fact that some things in a community's life were never entirely settled, only managed. What she had not expected was Mildred Boone. Mildred came on the last Saturday of September, in the late afternoon, when the light was going gold across the dry fields, and the air had the particular edge that meant real fall was close. She did not bring anything. She did not knock with the brisk authority she normally applied to knocking on doors. She knocked twice, quietly, and stood back from the door in a way that gave Clara room to decide what to do with it. Clara opened the door. Mildred Boone had never looked small to her before. Mildred had always occupied her space with the particular efficiency of a woman who had opinions about her space and everyone else's. Now she looked smaller than Clara remembered, or maybe the same size but differently arranged, less sure of the ground she was standing on. They looked at each other for a moment. "I'm not going to say it didn't start with me," Mildred said. Her voice was its usual pitch, but without the usual conviction under it. "The talk about the boy, I'm not going to pretend it started somewhere else." Clara said nothing. "I didn't invent it," Mildred said. "I want you to know that. The boy was sick, and you'd been teaching his sister and I saw what I saw, and I thought what I thought, and I said it out loud before I had the full picture." She paused. "But I said it out loud to a lot of people, and I kept saying it, and that's—" She stopped. Her hands, Clara noticed, were not clasped in front of her the way they usually were. They were at her sides, and they were not entirely still. "That's harder to say I didn't know what I was doing." "Why did you?" Clara asked. Not with anger, genuinely. Mildred's jaw worked for a moment. "Because you were getting—" She stopped again. Started differently. "Because I've lived in this valley for 27 years, and I know how it works, and I know what belongs, and I've always known what I know, and then this summer you—" She gestured at nothing specific and everything specific all at once. "And I didn't know what I know about any of it, and people were coming to you instead of— and I—" She stopped. She looked at Clara with the expression of a woman who has just heard herself say something that explains more than she intended to explain. Clara let the silence sit for a moment. Then, "I'm not going to tell you it didn't cause me harm," she said, "because it did. I had letters slipped under my door, Mildred, 3 of them, and families I'd been feeding for months walked away because of what you set in motion." Mildred received that without flinching, which cost her something visible. "But," Clara paused, "you came here and said what you said just now, and that matters to me. I won't pretend it doesn't." She looked at her. "The knowledge I have isn't going anywhere. This valley is going into a hard winter, and there's food available in it that most people still don't know how to find. I don't have time or interest in carrying this forward." She paused. "Do you?" Mildred was quiet for a long moment. The evening light came through the gap between the house and the barn and lit the side of her face. "No," she said finally. "I don't." "Then we're done with it," Clara said. Mildred Boone left the same way she'd come, without ceremony, down the porch steps and along the track north. Clara watched her go and felt not triumph, not vindication, but something quieter than either. The particular exhausted relief of a thing that has been heavy being set down at last. She went inside. She put water on for tea. She sat at the table in the fading light of the last Saturday of September, and she let herself be still for a few minutes, which was something she had not managed in weeks. Elias came in as the water was heating, and he looked at her face and at the empty porch visible through the open door and understood something had happened. "Mildred Boone was here," Clara said. He stopped. And we're done with it." He stood for a moment processing that. Then he came and sat across from her and looked at her with the expression she had come to know was his version of asking if she was all right. He would never quite say it outright, Elias, but it was in his face unmistakably. "I'm all right," she said. He nodded. He reached across the table and she gave him her hand, and the water came to a boil behind her, and outside the last of the daylight faded off the fields, and the valley settled into the early dark of fall. Winter was coming. There was still so much to do. The first frost came on the 4th of October, earlier than usual, and it came without apology. Clara woke to it before dawn the way she woke to most things, with the particular alertness of someone whose body had long since learned to read the air before the eyes opened. The temperature had dropped fast overnight, and the quality of the silence outside was different from a regular autumn silence, heavier, more complete. She lay in the dark for a moment and then got up and went to the window and saw the frost on the grass, gray-white in the pre-dawn, and felt the sharp lurch of a person who has been preparing for something and now finds it has arrived ahead of schedule. She was dressed and at the stove before Elias's boots hit the floor upstairs. He came down and looked at the frost through the window and said nothing for a moment. Then, "How much did we get in?" "Enough," Clara said. "Not as much as I wanted." She had spent September in a state of controlled urgency that Elias had recognized after the first week as something he should not try to interrupt or redirect but simply support. She had been everywhere at once. The creek banks in the mornings, her own root cellar in the afternoons, other people's root cellars when they would let her in, which most of them would by the end of the month. She had dried and salted and pickled and packed. She had showed families how to build simple storage that would keep wild greens through the cold months, root vegetables of all kinds, the dried seed heads of certain plants that could be ground into something resembling flour if the flour ran out. She had not slept as much as she should have. She had not eaten as regularly as she should have, which Elias had tried to address, and she had mostly deflected because there was always one more thing. Now winter was here, and what was in, and what wasn't was gone until spring, and Clara stood at her kitchen window with her coffee and looked at the frosted fields and did the accounting in her head that she had been doing every few days all of September. Which families had enough, which were close, which were the ones she needed to watch. The Callum family, she said. They came late to it. I need to check on them. I'll go, Elias said. She looked at him over her shoulder. I've been out to their place twice, he said. I know what they've got. He poured his own coffee. You're not the only one who's been paying attention, Clara. She turned back to the window. No, she said. You're right. I know you have. This was something she was still learning. Not to hold everything herself. It was harder than she expected, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. She had spent so many years being the only person in the room who knew what she knew that the habit of sole responsibility had gotten into her bones. And it did not come out easily just because the circumstances had changed. I'll go to the Hendersons this morning, she said, and the Morrison place. Then I want to check the South Creek bed. There were still some late greens last week that might have survived the frost. Take Ruth with you, Elias said, to the Morrison place. Ruth has been... She knows enough now to assess what Agnes has in storage without you having to walk through every item. It'll go faster. Clara looked at him. When did you and Ruth Henderson start planning my mornings? About 3 weeks ago, Elias said, completely without apology, when you stopped sleeping properly. She drank her coffee and didn't argue, because he was right, and they both knew it. The winter that came to Ash Hollow in 1888 was not the worst winter anyone in the valley could remember, but it was not a forgiving one either. The cold arrived in October and stayed, broken by brief thaws that raised everyone's hopes, and then a hard return that made the thaws feel like a cruelty. The snow came in November and did not entirely leave until March. The creek froze over in December, and some families who had depended on it for water had to break ice every morning, which was the kind of daily labor that wore people down in a way that wasn't dramatic enough to talk about but accumulated steadily through the weeks. And yet no family in Ash Hollow starved. It was not a comfortable winter. It was not a winter anyone looked back on fondly. There were weeks when the meals coming out of certain kitchens were nothing that would have been considered adequate in a good year. Thin soups extended with dried wild things, flatbreads made partly from the ground seed of wild grasses, pickled greens that had seemed like a curiosity in September and became simply supper in January. There was not much variety, and there was not much abundance, and some days there was not as much as anyone wanted. But the children got fed. That was the line Clara had drawn in her own mind at the beginning of all of this. The children get fed, and through one of the worst beetle years in the county's history, with gardens wiped out and stores depleted, and a winter that arrived 3 weeks ahead of schedule, she had held that line. She didn't let herself feel proud of it, exactly. Pride seemed like the wrong relationship to have with the simple fact of children not being hungry. It felt more like relief, the specific, slightly shaky relief of a person who has been holding something heavy for a long time and has put it down intact. She held her teaching kitchen through the winter, which was not what she had originally planned, but became necessary in the way practical things became necessary when you were paying attention to what the situation actually needed rather than what you had anticipated it would need. Women came on Tuesdays and Thursdays, through the cold and the snow and the weeks when the track to the south end of the valley was difficult, because the knowledge of how to use what they'd dried and pickled and packed required a different kind of teaching than the summer creek bank sessions had. The summer had been about finding things. The winter was about making something sufficient out of what you had, and that was a harder kind of cooking to teach because it required judgment rather than just technique. And judgment was not something you could hand to a person. You could only put them in enough situations where they had to develop it themselves. Ruth Henderson developed it faster than anyone. Clara watched it happen with something that genuinely moved her. The way Ruth, who had arrived in August as a frightened woman looking for a lifeline, had by December become someone who could walk into her own pantry and construct a nourishing meal from whatever was in it without consulting Clara or a list. She had that particular quality of the genuinely taught person, which is that she started generating her own questions rather than just answering Clara's. "What do you know about wild roots?" Ruth asked one Thursday afternoon in January, sitting at Clara's table with a cup of tea and the focused expression she now habitually wore when there was something to learn. "Not the ones we picked in fall, the ones that are still in the ground now. I was looking at the south fence line yesterday, and there are these dried stems that I think might be—" "Bring me one of the stems tomorrow," Clara said. "I'll know what it is when I see it." "But if it is what I think it might be, would it be worth—" "Bring me the stem and we'll talk about it." Clara looked at her across the table. "You're thinking like someone who lives in this country instead of someone who's just passing through it." Ruth blinked. Then she did something she didn't do often. She smiled, a real one, without the anxious edge that had always been present in her smiles the first months Clara had known her. "I think," Ruth said, "that's the nicest thing anyone's said to me in a while." "It's just true," Clara said. George Henderson had grown 3 inches by January, which his mother attributed to the wild greens with the semi-serious certainty of a woman who had decided this was probably the explanation and was not interested in being argued out of it. He had also, somewhere between August and the New Year, developed into something Clara recognized with a quality of recognition that felt almost personal. A person who moved through the land around them with attention, who saw what was there rather than what they expected to be there. He appeared at Clara's door one cold Saturday in February, with a piece of paper on which he had drawn, in the careful, deliberate way of someone who takes things seriously, a map of his family's property showing every location where he had identified edible plants. "I wanted to ask you," he said, standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands and his breath visible in the cold air, "if I got them right." Clara took the map and looked at it. She looked at it for a while, tracing the fence lines and the creekside marks and the symbols he'd invented for different plant types. "You got most of them right," she said. "There are 2 I'd question. Come in and let me show you." He came in and sat at the table, and they went through the map together, and Clara corrected the 2 misidentifications and confirmed everything else. And George listened with the quality of attention that was, she thought, the thing she most valued in a student. Not just absorbing information, but actively building an internal structure that could generate new understanding on its own. "Why do you want to know all this?" Clara asked at some point, genuinely curious rather than testing him. George considered it. He was 12 now, or close enough that the difference didn't matter, and he had the kind of considered quality in conversation that was not typical for 12-year-old boys, though Clara suspected it had always been there, and the summer had simply drawn it out. "Because it's ours," he said finally. "The land is ours. My dad's land. And the stuff that grows on it is ours too. But we didn't know about most of it." He paused. "That seems like a waste." Clara looked at him for a moment. "That," she said, "is the best answer to that question I've ever heard." He looked slightly embarrassed, the way 12-year-old boys looked when they were pleased and didn't want to show it. "You probably say that to everyone." "I really don't," Clara said. Tick. The spring came in late March, tentatively at first, and then with the sudden insistence of all springs after hard winters, as though the season had been waiting just out of sight and came rushing in once it was permitted. The snow went fast, and the creek rose with the melt, and the mud was extraordinary, and then the first green appeared along the banks and the fence lines and the disturbed ground around every structure in the valley, and something in the collective mood of Ash Hollow shifted in a way that was almost audible. Clara was out in it immediately, the way she was always out in it. The first morning the ground was soft enough to move through properly. She went to the creek first, as always, and the creek showed her what it always showed her in spring. The tender beginning of things, the first purslane and lamb's quarters, and the nettles just coming up, everything green and sharp and startlingly itself against the dead gray of the winter's leavings. She was not alone this spring. That was the difference. Ruth was behind her, and behind Ruth were Agnes Morrison and her daughter Margaret, and 2 of the younger Marsh women who had been coming to the Tuesday session since November and had, quietly and without making any announcement about it, simply incorporated what they were learning into the way they moved through their own days. Callum's wife was there, and her two daughters, and the daughters had brought a friend who lived a mile up the road and had never met Clara but had heard about the creek sessions and wanted to come. Clara looked back at all of them, this loose, disparate group moving along the creek bank in the thin spring light, and felt something she didn't have a precise word for. Not pride, not satisfaction exactly, though there was satisfaction in it. Something more specific than either of those, the particular feeling of looking at a thing you built out of necessity and discovering it became something else on its own, something that went beyond what you intended and no longer needed you in quite the way it once did. That was a good feeling, a complicated one, but good. "Purslane coming up here," Margaret Morrison called from 15 feet ahead, crouching down with the focused look she'd been developing all winter. "And I think there's lamb's quarters in the gravel just past the bend." "Don't pick the purslane yet," Claire called back. "Let it get another week. It's better when it's a little bigger." "How do you know when it's big enough?" "Come here and I'll show you." Margaret came back at a trot, and Clara showed her, not just what to look for, but why, the whole underlying principle of harvesting at the right moment that applied to every plant and not just this one. She taught it not as a rule, but as an idea, the way she had learned to teach everything by now. Here is the thing, and here's the reason for the thing, and once you understand the reason, you can figure out the rules yourself. The morning went on, the group moving along the creek, and Clara moved with them and among them, and felt the season change around all of them together. The County Agricultural Society met in April in the town of Dunning, 20 miles east of Ash Hollow, in the large room above the hardware store that served as the county's primary gathering space for anything that required more than 30 people and a table. Clara received the letter of invitation in the third week of March, hand-delivered by a man named Alderman Greer, who served as the Society's secretary and had the slightly nervous energy of someone whose job required him to deal with a great many people whose self-importance was not always proportional to their actual importance. The letter asked her to present her methods and findings to the Society at the April meeting. It was formal and slightly stiff in the way of official letters, and it did not mention what had happened in the valley over the past year, and it did not acknowledge that she was a woman or that there had been any particular circumstances surrounding her arrival at the point of being invited to speak. It simply stated the invitation and the date, and signed itself on behalf of the membership. Elias read it over her shoulder and said, "Are you going to go?" "I haven't decided," Clara said. "The same people who—" "I know who'll be there," Clara said. She sat with the letter for 2 days. She thought about what it meant to go and what it meant not to go, and she thought about the creek bank and the winter kitchen and George Henderson's map and Margaret Morrison identifying Purslane from 30 feet away. She thought about all the things she knew that were still not known by people who needed to know them, and she thought about the specific question of whether the kind of respectability the Agricultural Society represented was something she wanted. She decided on the second evening that she didn't particularly want their respectability, but she wanted the platform that came with it, and those were different things, and she was not going to let her feelings about the former stop her from using the latter. "I'm going," she told Elias. "Good," he said immediately, like a man who had been waiting for that answer. "Don't say you knew I would," she said. "I wasn't going to say that," he said, entirely unconvincingly. "Bob." She stood in front of the Dunning Agricultural Society on a Tuesday evening in April, with 43 men and 6 women in chairs before her, and Elias standing against the back wall, and Alderman Greer sitting at the side with his pen ready, and she was nervous in the way that was physical rather than mental. Her hands were steady, but her stomach was not, and she had that particular heightened awareness of her own body that came with standing in front of a room full of people who were waiting to assess you. She looked at them. Farmers, mostly. The kind of men who had built their lives around the idea that the land yielded what you planted in it, and not much else. Several of them were looking at her with the polite skepticism of people who were here because they'd heard something and didn't know what to make of it. A few were looking at her with the more active skepticism of people who had already decided what to make of it. 1 or 2, the ones whose faces were slightly more open, who sat forward rather than back, were there because they were genuinely curious. She decided to talk to the ones who were genuinely curious and trust that the others would either follow or not. "I'm going to tell you what I told the families in Ash Hollow when the Beatles came," she said. which is that there's more food growing on your land right now than most of you know about. And knowing about it is the difference between a hard year and a catastrophic one. She talked for an hour. She talked about specific plants, named them, described them, told people where to find them and how to know them and what to do with them. She talked about the principle underneath the specifics, which was that the land had its own logic, and that logic rewarded attention and punished the assumption that the only things worth knowing were the things people had put there themselves. She talked about what the winter in Ash Hollow had looked like, not in terms of hardship, but in terms of what had worked. What people had dried and how they'd stored it, and which preparations had lasted and which hadn't. She talked about George Henderson's map, because it was the thing she was proudest of, and it cost her nothing to be honest about that. She said a 12-year-old boy had taught himself to catalog the edible plants on his family's property because he'd decided the land was his, and he ought to know what was in it, and that this was the right relationship to have with the land, and that it was available to everyone in the room if they were willing to pay the kind of attention it required. Nobody interrupted her. The room was quiet in the particular way of people who are being given information they hadn't expected to be given and are trying to figure out what to do with it. When she finished, there was a pause, and then a man in the front row, older, white-haired, the look of someone who had been farming this country for 40 years, said, "The purslane. You said it grows in disturbed soil. My whole farm's disturbed soil." "Then you have a great deal of purslane," Clara said. "I've been pulling it as a weed for 40 years." "I know," Clara said. "Most people have." He looked at her for a moment. "What else have I been pulling up that I shouldn't have?" The room moved then, a kind of collective exhale that was also, if you were paying attention, the sound of a group of people beginning to genuinely reconsider something. Several people started talking at once. Alderman Greer's pen began moving. The woman closest to Clara leaned forward and asked 3 questions in rapid succession and didn't wait for the answers before asking the next one, which Clara took as the best possible sign. She answered questions for another hour. She talked until her voice was slightly rough, and the candles in the room had burned down noticeably, and Elias, against the back wall, was standing with his arms folded and the quiet expression of a man watching something he had always known was coming finally arrive. She didn't become famous from that evening. She didn't become respected throughout the county in some sweeping final way that resolved everything neatly. That was not how things worked, and she knew it well enough by now not to expect it. What happened was smaller and more durable. The society published a summary of her presentation in the County Gazette, with her name attached, which meant that farms 20 and 30 miles away received the information, and some of them used it. Alderman Greer wrote to her twice over the following summer with questions from farmers who had read the summary and wanted to know more, and she answered both letters in detail. A woman in a township to the north wrote to ask if Clara would be willing to come out and walk some land with her, and Clara went and brought Ruth along because Ruth was by now a competent enough teacher to handle the basic identification work on her own. In Ash Hollow itself, the gathering of wild plants became simply part of what families did, not instead of farming, but alongside it, integrated into the ordinary practice of maintaining a household on land that, it turned out, had always been more generous than anyone had credited. George Henderson's map was not a curiosity. It was the beginning of a practice that became common, that children grew up learning the way they grew up learning anything practical about the land they lived on. Mildred Boone came to the Tuesday sessions in May, arriving at the creek bank with the matter-of-fact air of someone who has decided to do a thing and is not going to make a production of it. She came, and she listened, and she took notes in her precise handwriting, and she asked questions that were, Clara had to admit, quite good. Mildred had a structured, organized intelligence that, applied to something other than managing the valley's social architecture, was genuinely useful. She was not comfortable to teach. She held her knowledge with a slight proprietary quality even as she was acquiring it, as though she might at any moment produce it as something she'd always known. Clara taught her anyway, because the knowledge mattered more than the ego surrounding it. That was something the whole summer had taught her. That the knowledge mattered more than almost everything else you could think to put beside it. More than credit, more than approval, more than the question of whether people thought well of you while they were benefiting from what you knew. She had not become the woman she was by needing those things to be in order before she acted. She had become the woman she was by acting anyway. Elias found her at the creek one morning in June, early, before most of the valley was awake. She was where she always was, at the water's edge in her sturdiest boots, her basket in the crook of her arm, her hair coming loose from its knot in the way it always did. The summer was going to be a better one than last year. The beetles hadn't returned, the rains had been regular, and the kitchen gardens the valley had replanted in spring were coming up well. There was less urgency in the mornings now. She came to the creek from habit and love rather than from necessity, and she understood the difference between those motivations and was glad to be back to the one that had started everything. Elias came and stood beside her and looked at the water and said nothing for a minute. "Frank Henderson asked me yesterday," he said, "if you'd be willing to teach a session specifically for the men, the older ones who never came to the creek. He thinks he can get them to come if it's—" He paused. "If it's framed differently." "Framed as something for men," Clara said. "Essentially." She thought about it. She thought about the principle of it, whether it bothered her that the knowledge had to be packaged a certain way to reach certain people, and decided that the packaging was the packaging and the knowledge was the knowledge, and they were not the same thing. "Tell Frank yes," she said. "Tuesday mornings. They can meet Elias at the north fence line, and I'll be at the creek crossing." Elias turned to look at her. "You want me to lead part of it?" "You've been doing this long enough," Clara said. "You know enough. The men will listen to you in a way they won't listen to me, and that's just the truth of things, and the children get fed either way." He was quiet for a moment, then, "You're not bothered by that?" She looked at the creek. She thought about what she'd been when she started, the heavy woman with the strange habits that nobody took seriously, and what she was now, which was not entirely different but inhabited differently, more deliberately, with less of the old apologetic quality she hadn't even been aware of carrying until she'd put it down. "I used to be," she said honestly. "I spent a lot of years being bothered by needing to justify what I knew to people who hadn't earned the right to require justification." She paused. "But I've gotten old enough to understand that the goal isn't to be acknowledged. The goal is for people to know the thing that needs knowing. And if Elias Rowan teaching at the north fence line is how that happens, then that's what works." Elias stood beside her in the morning quiet. The creek went on doing what it always did. "I think," he said after a while, "that you are the most practical person I've ever known." "You say that like it's a new observation." "It's a recurring one," he said. "I keep having it." She almost laughed. Not quite. It was too early, and she was still too much in the particular stillness of the creek in the morning, but almost. She reached into her basket and held something up. A small bunch of watercress, newly cut, bright green, wet from the creek. "Take that home," she said. "Put it in eggs for breakfast. Tell me what you think." He took it. He looked at it in the way he had learned to look at things she handed him, with genuine attention, not performance. "I'll tell you at breakfast," he said. He went back up the bank toward the house, and Clara turned back to the water, and the morning went on around her the way mornings did. Indifferent, necessary, full of the kind of small, unremarkable abundance that most people walked past every day of their lives and never once stopped to see. She saw it. She had always seen it. That, in the end, was the whole story. Not a triumph, not a redemption arc, not a woman who saved a valley and was recognized for it in some permanent and satisfying way. Just a person who paid attention when the world gave her something worth knowing, and kept paying attention when other people didn't see the point, and went on keeping faith with what she knew even when it cost her. There was no great lesson in it beyond that. Or maybe that was the lesson, and it was just that simple things didn't always sound like enough when you said them out loud. The creek moved on. The green things grew. Clara Ashbourne stood in the morning with her basket on her arm and did what she had always done. She looked at what was there, and she learned it, and she carried it home.